Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Welcome, everyone, to this lesson on Othello. Hello, hello. Hello and welcome to everyone joining this live stream on Othello, focused specifically on the characters of Brabantio, Roderigo, and Cassio. Welcome, welcome. I'll give us a moment just to join if people are rushing home from school or clicking away from another My Edspace course to take this English A-level course as well. So I'll just give people a moment, but this is part of our free stream series on Othello and part of the My Edspace English curriculum for Key Stage 5, which is this course run by me, Eleanor, and held every Wednesday and Friday. Wednesdays from 6:50 to 8:20 and on Fridays from 4:30 to 6. So these live streams are all part of the Key Stage 5 My Edspace experience, which are offered for free across the year, and will cover all of the most commonly studied topics in A-level, from drama to prose to poetry across the year, and will give anyone studying A-level or perhaps thinking about A-level the opportunity to advance their knowledge a little bit, add some breadth and depth to their knowledge, and an opportunity to ask questions. The chat function is available to anyone following this live stream. So you will be able to put your questions or comments or ideas into the chat. Part of A-level literature that's fundamental to the experience is the idea of discussion. So welcoming discussion at any point of people putting ideas into the chat and sharing their knowledge or sharing what they want to in terms of reactions about these characters. So these characters are our final three characters we're going to be looking at in this much detail before we start moving on to theme work. So after today, the other lessons are going to be focused specifically on themes, different lines of arguments about themes, so that we've covered both the key characters in the play in as much detail as possible, as well as all of the likely themes that may come up across the different mark schemes, across the different exam specifications, to ensure that you feel prepared for your mocks or prepared for your exams and ready to go going forwards. So Brabantio, Roderigo and Cassio. Let's start. Just a review before we do. This is me. I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the teachers at My Edspace, and I'm teaching the Key Stage 5 course along with many of the other subject or other year groups of English within My Edspace. So let's get started with a review. Pop into the chat what you know about Brabantio, Roderigo, Michael Cassio, Bianca, and themes in Othello. Doesn't have to be full sentences, doesn't have to be an essay level answer. Just pop what you know, what you don't know, any confusion you have about them, any memories, because that will start off our discussion. Brabantio first I'd like to talk about, so take a moment to pop into the chat. The chat should be available for you to access yourself and thus to participate. Take a moment to do so. Great. Okay. So, just to get us started, a little bit of review, because it's good to know what people know, and I'll of course pause as people put things into the chat to address theirs as well, or any questions they have about these characters. Brabantio is a Venetian nobleman. He's part of the Venetian elite. He is linked with the Duke and appears to be part of the Duke's council. In that, he is surprised when in Act 1 it's revealed that the Duke has been in council during this night, seemingly out of hours, without consulting him, without addressing him as part of it. So we know that this is he's got some kind of governmental position here. We also know that he is the father of Desdemona. Desdemona, who we've spoken about at length. We have a whole hour and a half on Desdemona, if you can see in the playlist of Eleanor Does English, Key Stage 5 stuff. He's the father of Desdemona, who is this kind of jewel of Venetian nobility. She is part of the Venetian elite as well, and her virginity, her reputation is so perfect that she will be an excellent negotiating tool for him in gaining more power in society. We know that he's a big part of Venetian society and Venetian social society because Othello tells us so. He is someone who invites this famed, respected general to stay with him or to have him to dinner. So he hosts Othello, not necessarily overnight, which probably wouldn't be appropriate because he has an unwed daughter in the house as well. But he hosts Othello for dinners. Othello says that he loved me. We talked about stories. We shared war stories together. And so clearly this is part of sort of the society of the time, right? Brabantio is the host. People come to Brabantio. People respect him. What about him as a character? He's controlling, first of all. Certainly controlling. Controlling not just of his daughter, but of the people around him. He tells them what to do. He expects results from them. He expects certain behaviours and certain treatment from them. He is also very dominant. He sort of takes over the scenes he's in. And we can see as well his volatility. By that I mean the fact that he flies off the handle and reacts so explosively. Part of the reason he reacts so explosively is because he, like any of the Venetian elite, particularly the men, prioritizes his reputation. He loves his daughter, but when she threatens his reputation, he takes her to court and tries to sort of publicly humiliate her into leaving her husband, and appears to care more about what this will do to him than about her happiness. So, loves his daughter, but prioritizes his reputation and his control. We're going to see more of this going forward. So this is the first. Zakaya, hello, welcome. Feel free to pop into the chat anything you know about these characters. We're just reviewing this as a start to getting into the play and into these characters. Roderigo then next. Who's Roderigo? Roderigo is also a Venetian noble. He's young, and he is a suitor of Desdemona's. We will see that he's an unsuccessful suitor of Desdemona's, not least because she marries someone else, and that the play opens with him saying, "Have you heard this news? Are you kidding me?" Right? He is young and foolish. He sort of is some of the humour of the piece, is that he is so kind of lovesick that he seems fully hopeless as a character. We don't root for him as an audience. Zaccaria, you're asking who's Desdemona. Desdemona is Othello's wife. She is one of the protagonists of the play. So she is the wife of Othello. She's Brabantio's daughter. And she marries Othello at the start of the play, and that sort of the action transpires from there. So he's this hopeless character, so much so that he aligns himself with Iago. Iago uses Roderigo to get what he wants. Firstly, money. Iago is paid by Roderigo to help woo Desdemona, first of all. Does Iago use this money and this jewelry he's given to help win Desdemona's heart? No. He sells it or keeps it for his own and seemingly admits this immediately to the other characters / to us as an audience, saying, this fool, this idiot, he's my purse, so he's kind of my wallet here. So Iago does this first. Then he's also used in order to goad Brabantio next. So because Roderigo is personally offended by Desdemona's marriage to Othello, and seemingly is even more racist than Iago in some ways, Iago kind of sets him off to stir up Brabantio as well. And it's Roderigo, actually, who says quite a lot of the graphic imagery of that first act. Then we can see that this all transpires into bringing it to court and this public setting and interruption of Desdemona and Othello's first night of marriage. So we can see those anxieties of miscegenation immediately there. But then we also have this idea of Iago just trying to work up everyone and kind of steer this general sentiment against Othello and Desdemona's marriage. Then we have there's something on my back. I think it's just the green screen is sort of twiddling a little bit, but I'm okay. Don't worry about me. Then he also does talk about Roderigo being Iago's pawn as he attempts to get revenge on Othello and Cassio. And Roderigo is manipulated into doing all kinds of things, from starting fights with Cassio to spreading rumours to attempting to kill Cassio as well, and to set Desdemona and Othello against each other. Then Cassio, we've mentioned him. Cassio has been mentioned. Michael Cassio is Othello's lieutenant. He is a Florentine, which means he's from Florence, not from Venice. Florence and Venice are trading rivals, so we can see that possibly that would mean that Cassio is somewhat an outsider as well. He is also, despite being the lieutenant, or the lieutenant, depending on where you're from, despite being the lieutenant, he is also potentially an inexperienced soldier. Now, I put this with a question mark because it's only Iago who tells us this, and it's Othello who promotes him, and we don't hear Othello and Cassio's side of how experienced Cassio is. We just know that Iago says he's experienced, but because it's Iago, we have to give a little bit of doubt as well. He is also a very charming and courteous and handsome man. Young man, probably the same age as Roderigo. And as such, he's very well loved by the women of Venice. As Zaccaria said, a man of high manners and theoretical learning, one of Othello's chief lieutenants. Yes. So this idea that he's an inexperienced soldier, but he's got a lot of the theory down. Othello and Iago, in particular, Iago describes him as a mathematician, so he's kind of a theorist rather than a experienced soldier in the field. And yes, he's got a lot of good manners. He's very courteous. Okay, so lots of people are in love with him, including Bianca. He is Bianca's lover. Bianca, Cassio implies, to be a sex worker, what they would call a prostitute in the play. So a little bit different here element to him, other than just being this courteous man who's really well respected and promoted really highly. He also has this other side to him that we see as well. Who's Bianca? She is from Venice. She is in love with Cassio. It appears that they have a physical relationship. And it's unclear whether or not she is a sex worker. Iago says she is. Cassio implies she is, but we don't really know for sure. And she says she's not. So, something to consider here is who's saying what and why they might be saying it, right? We do know that she follows Cassio to Cyprus in order to be with him. And that she is frustrated by his inattention to her. She sort of is clingy to him, he describes, and she can't get what she wants from him. She wants to be married to him. Iago says this, she's saying it to everyone that she wants to be married. She expects you guys to be married. And Cassio says, no, me a customer, he says to her. We'll get into this further. But we know that she is not treated the same way as Emilia and Desdemona are. In fact, Emilia calls her a hussy and a strumpet, and she defends herself against that, but there is certainly a distance between her and the other two women in the play. Then themes that appear in Othello. We've got jealousy. We've got gender, race, appearance versus reality, love, deception. We could go on forever, right? Marriage, friendship, manipulation, which we will see how we link to as we go through these different arguments about these characters. So first of all, Brabantio. Just a little summary first. Brabantio is a wealthy and powerful Venetian. His daughter Desdemona's beauty and modesty will be an excellent pawn for him to use to gain more power. After all, it is through her immaculate reputation that Brabantio's own reputation is preserved as a capable and powerful father and man. So immediately we see there the dependence of women's reputation for men's power. From Act 1, the audience can see that Brabantio views Desdemona's both as an object and part of a business transaction that would benefit him. He refuses to believe that the coveted Desdemona could possibly have fallen in love with Othello without the intervention of witchcraft or potions. He ruefully mutters that he would prefer her to be dead rather than married to Othello. Interestingly, however, Othello describes that Brabantio had loved him and often invited Othello to his house to discuss military tactics and reminisce on adventures. However, this hospitality and love evaporates immediately when Othello becomes involved with his daughter. The explicit and racialized goading from Iago and Roderigo is all it takes to strip this veneer from Brabantio and reveal his deeply entrenched racism and xenophobia. His hypocrisy is revealed as he immediately believes that Othello is a devilish and aggressive predator, despite knowing and supposedly loving him enough to host him. Brabantio's language reveals several ideas about Venetian and Jacobean society. He embodies the power and prejudices of the Venetian elite, whose rigid hierarchy is threatened by Othello's presence. Never mind his marriage into this exclusive group. He captures what society views of Othello, thus making it easier for us to understand how Iago is able to manipulate Othello as an outsider. Thus, it is Brabantio who introduces the ideas of racism, mistrust, betrayal, and jealousy into the play in its earliest stages. And we see foreshadowed Othello's trajectory through Brabantio's own loss of control and reason. Desdemona's treachery in marrying Othello embarrasses Brabantio on the public stage, and so he publicly disowns her. Indeed, while it appears that his wounded ego is the greater loss than his actual daughter, who he refuses to host whilst Othello is in Cyprus. He later dies of grief offstage, and his brother Graziano reveals that it was Desdemona's match that caused his early death. So firstly, what does Brabantio reveal about Jacobean society? Well, first of all, the position of women within it, right? Women as transactional and important for men's reputation. We also have this idea of this veneer of society here. That the power and prejudices of this group is threatened by Othello, and thus any tolerance, seemingly, when the society is threatened by this outsider, will be immediately stripped away. It also is capturing what society views of Othello, right? We have him as a mouthpiece of society's prejudices, and it makes it easier for a society who is not Jacobean to understand where the sort of zeitgeist is. Brabantio's purpose here? To introduce, perhaps, to capture society's view of Othello, and to introduce us to these ideas of racism, mistrust, betrayal, and jealousy across the play. Yikes. It's a little too wiggly there. And thus we see this foreshadowing of Othello. So it's like a microcosm that Brabantio becomes here for Othello's own trajectory as well. And then what is Brabantio's ending? He dies. So sort of lesser tragedy here, because we don't really become attached too much to Brabantio. He disowns her. His reputation is destroyed. He dies off stage. Yikes. A little bit clearer highlighting there. There we go. So it seems like his grief at his daughter's marriage and loss is fatal to him, and he dies as a result. Hi Top Frozen, thank you for joining us. And let's take a look at a couple of different ways that he's presented here, and then we will formulate some lines of argument with some guidance as to how we can argue different ideas about Brabantio, because though he's a minor character, he can serve us in lots of ways, talking about specific themes, but also if he comes up as a character, or male characters come up, or fathers or men and women come up as the theme for your exam question or your paper, then it's important to think about him as someone who can be useful and someone we can draw information from. So I'm going to read this part that Brabantio says, and we'll think then about what this gives us in terms of a presentation about Brabantio. So Brabantio says, and this is from Act 1, "Damned as thou art, thou hast enchanted her." He is saying this to Othello. "For I'll refer me to all things of sense. If she in chains of magic were not bound, whether a maid so tender, fair, and happy, so opposite to marriage that she shunned the wealthy curled darlings of our nation, would ever have, to incur a general mock, run from her guarded to the sooty bosom of such a thing as thou, to fear, not to delight." So here, what do we see? We see, firstly, that this character here is embodying so much of the societal views of Othello here. We see this idea of magic here. Firstly, this idea of magic first. So this then stereotypical view of Othello as, because he is from Africa, or because he is a Moor, he has this villainous, demonic, devilish ability that to deceive, to trick, to enchant. And enchant without the positive connotations here, right? Secondly, we have this idea of the racism of Brabantio and thus of society, of Othello as something that's damned, of something that would dominate here, that would have a sooty bosom and described as something to be feared, a thing as thou here as well. So firstly, the dehumanizing language. Secondly, this hellish language here of this fear and this thing and the sootiness. So this colour theory here of the blackness of Othello, firstly being black and thus linked with devilry, but secondly at being sooty, so being like ash and thus something that stains or marks something else, like Desdemona and her reputation and her chastity. So this idea of black and white interplaying here immediately. So we think of him as portraying or as describing Othello as a devil. Then we think of the juxtaposition that happens here. In presenting these wealthy curled darlings who Desdemona shunned. Now these are the elite of Venice, the suitors of Desdemona that she shunned. And to contrast this to this fearsome thing as thou, to fear, not to delight. So this idea of running from protection and safety and society into this evil, contaminating force that will enslave her. Very interesting language, this chains of magic, if we're thinking as well about Othello's race and this time of these kind of anxieties about race and this justification of the transatlantic slave trade, this kind of subversion of power dynamics between black and white people in this presentation here, that perhaps puts the onus of this relationship and the destruction on Othello, as well as Desdemona here. Similarly, we also have this idea of what Desdemona is like. this maid so tender, fair, and happy. This she, and notice he hardly ever refers to her by her name, but rather as this third being. And this idea that she was opposite to marriage, that she kept away from anyone. So this idea of purity and chastity, so much so that she wasn't running into marriage. She wasn't this desperate kind of yearning figure. She was so passive that she was resistant to marriage. And this idea of running from her guardage. So this idea of running from her protection. But notice that idea of guardage, contrasting with this chains of magic. And this idea of enchantment and how she got out, which is something Brabantio also says in Act 1. This idea of her being confined and controlled here, and protected, but through this control on her. And that her being out of Brabantio's control is something, a big part of why he is so apoplectic here. Notice as well this language here, to incur a general mock. So Brabantio thinking here about the reputation here of her not daring to do this because it would be causing public humiliation for her to be so transgressive in her behaviour and in her choice of husband. Here, that she would incur general mocking and humiliation. And this makes sense with what French says here. His opposition is rooted in fears about racial mixing, disrupting social hierarchies. We can see that he cares about hierarchies because of the setting of this play and this scene in particular, but also because he's doing this all publicly in front of everyone, and because he seems to be worried not about her happiness, but rather about what Othello might have done to her and how this looks for him. So this general mock here really being crucial to our understanding of Brabantio, as well as this idea of Othello being something fearful, this physical appearance being really clear as to why he objects to this marriage, because it upsets the control that he has over his own microcosm of society, his family, and what this will do to the hierarchy then in general. Let's take a look at another idea with Brabantio. Brabantio, Othello says in his defence, her father loved me, oft invited me, firstly. So this idea that this is a very much different from previously. And Brabantio says she is abused, stolen from me, and corrupted by spells and medicines bought of mountebanks, for nature so preposterously to err, being not deficient, blind, or lame of sense, sans witchcraft could not. So she's saying there's some abuse or some spell or witchcraft going on here because nature could not be so terribly wrong. So by saying this, Desdemona's beauty, reputation, etc., appearance could not be so in contrast to her actual behaviour here that it doesn't make any sense. She's not deficient, so she's not she's intelligent, she's not blind, she's not unable to have senses, so she has to be with witchcraft, because again he's saying this choice doesn't make sense to anyone obvious. Brabantio says again, look to her more, notice, if thou hast eyes to see, she has deceived her father and may thee. So change from the beginning here, this beloved daughter, to not only disowning and disregarding and rejecting fundamentally this previously beloved friend of his, but also rejecting Desdemona, refusing to take her in when Othello is going to go to Cyprus, and rather views her as someone who deceives and as some kind of villainous character who can't be controlled and thus can only damage. And here then it really does seem that Brabantio does sow the seeds for Othello to doubt Desdemona, because if she could transgress society's expectations so fundamentally in running away in the middle of the night and marrying someone her father fundamentally rejects as a suitor, and then standing up to him in court and saying, actually, no, I'm going to stay with my husband, is terrifying to Brabantio and would be terrifying to the Jacobeans. As Booth says, Brabantio represents the patriarchal figure whose authority is challenged by Desdemona's choice to marry Othello. So here we can see the real issue, right? That Brabantio is not upset about the marriage, but rather about the fact that his authority has been challenged so fundamentally. And as such, he brings it in with the our nation, my brothers of state, etc., when he's talking about the court, saying that this is actually threatening our way of life. She says, bondsmen and slaves shall our senators be. So he's saying, if this is allowed to proceed, society will be overturned. So he really is the institution here. He is the elite. He is the voice of society. He's the voice of patriarchy that controls women and does not trust them to be strong enough to make their own decisions or to choose for themselves, and is angry and thinks they deserve punishments afterwards. And then this is what we find, our final word about Brabantio. Gratiano says in Act 5, Scene 2, poor Desdemon, and notice that shortened name there is again, as we saw in our lesson about Desdemona specifically. I am glad thy father's dead. Thy match was mortal to him, and pure grief shore his old thread in twain. Did he live now, this sight would make him do a desperate turn. Yea, curse his better angel from his side, and fall to reprobation. So what is this saying? This is saying Gratiano, while seeing Desdemona on the bed killed and Othello standing over her admitting to it, says, I'm glad your father is dead, because your match killed him, and grief shore his old thread in twain. So cut his life off. This is a reference to Greek mythology and the three fates. Did he live now, this sight would have made him do a desperate turn, so probably either commit suicide or be grief-stricken and have the same thing happen, and yea, curse his better angel from his side and fall to reverence. So he would send away all his good holiness and his good about him, his morality, and fall to reverence, so fall into evil. This would make him turn to evil if he saw this. And that's interesting, right? Because that presents us a character who would rather die, as Cox says, than be dishonoured. First of all, not only is she a defiant daughter, but now she's also being named as a whore and a strumpet and killed for her adultery. This is too much, Gratiano says, for Brabantio to bear. And this would cause him to turn to evil. Again, this shows that the power of dishonour, that it destroys someone, right? It would literally turn them to evil, and they'd prefer, and Gratiano, his own brother, prefers he'd be dead than to see this. And Bradley interestingly says as well, Brabantio's impotence, or his powerlessness here, with elements there of that masculinity that really does speak to Brabantio's character, in preventing the marriage, marks him as a tragic figure whose authority is undermined. So that's interesting, right? First of all, the fact that his authority is undermined, but he's a tragic figure. He is driven to tragedy in a very similar but smaller scale way to Othello here, because perhaps his authority is undermined here, because he's not able to keep power. And this is what Iago and Roderigo and Brabantio warn Othello, right? Is you better keep power over him, over her, Desdemona, or you'll be destroyed. Right? So what can we think about with lines of argument about Brabantio? We can organise our thoughts into a couple of different ideas here. We can think about him firstly as someone who is a vehicle for society's prejudices. So him as embodying, in other words, society's prejudices and reflective of their values as well. Could we split this up to talk about his misogyny and sexism in one and his racism in another? Absolutely. Depends on how much you're going to include about Brabantio in this essay, what this essay would be asking you. You could also think of him as particularly a patriarchal institution who attempts to control, or whose power over women, power, control, whichever you like, is threatened by Othello, perhaps. You could also say that he embodies these patriarchal desires to control. So in this way, we would split up this idea of talking about the racism, the xenophobia of Brabantio and of society, perhaps using Brabantio as a springboard, or perhaps using him as the whole paragraph. And then in argument 2, we can think about his control over the society, and then get more into his losing of control, linking to reputation and its value in Jacobean society and Venetian society. We could also talk about him as hypocritical here in a second argument, right? We could also talk about him as hypocritical. Because he once loved Othello, but this is stripped off when he is threatened. And then finally, we could also think about, so this is sort of argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, and then argument 4, really, is thinking about the fact that he's destroyed by treachery or by his own powerlessness. I say treachery because that's what he calls Desdemona's betrayal of him. Perhaps that this highlights the role reputation of patriarchy, of fathers, of weakness, etc. in society, but focusing particularly on that ending, and thinking about both his loss of control as well as his ending off stage, his value, his perhaps his foil to Othello, or him as a microcosm or a foreshadowing of Othello's own downfall. If you have any questions about Brabantio, feel free to put them in the chat, or any ideas about him, feel free to put in the chat. Let's move on to Roderigo, because we've got so much to cover that I want to make sure that we have time enough for each character. So, Roderigo is a wealthy but unintelligent Venetian who longs for Desdemona. The play's first line belongs to him, as he bemoans that though he is paying Iago to help him win Desdemona's hand, it has just become known that Desdemona has secretly married Othello. Iago promises to help Roderigo steal away Desdemona, but also reveals to us that he has sold for a profit the jewellery Roderigo gave him to give to Desdemona. It is revealed across the play how continuously Roderigo falls for Iago's machinations. Iago also actively uses Roderigo as a plot device in his own scenes to destroy Cassio and Othello. Indeed, Roderigo, is who I mean by he, dies as Iago stabs him in the back in order to ensure that Roderigo does not reveal Iago's machinations against Othello or his instigation of the plot to kill Othello. It is also suggested in Roderigo's interaction with Brabantio that he's been a nuisance in attempting to court Desdemona. Roderigo becomes a humorous character whose moon-eyed lovesickness and misplaced trust in Iago makes him seem both desperate and silly. However, this seemingly harmless lover is also deeply prejudiced and describes both Othello and his marriage in graphic, sexually explicit and offensively racist terms. He is a Venetian and an insider who is insulted that Othello has taken what he feels he is owed and deserves, thus also foregrounding that Desdemona's body is viewed transactionally by the male characters in the play. So another really helpful person to talk about the transactional nature of women in the play, if we're talking about male characters as well, or if we're talking about the ways that Desdemona is viewed, we can think of Roderigo as a way to contribute to that argument. So what is Roderigo's relationship with Iago, firstly? That he asks Iago to help him steal Desdemona away, but really Iago is manipulating him. He continuously falls for Iago, and Iago uses him as a plot device. And Iago stabs him in the back at the end. Now, in what ways could Roderigo be viewed as a foil for Othello? Well, possibly because he is this unintelligent Venetian, right, who doesn't get Desdemona. Whereas Othello is clearly clever and interesting and experienced and intelligent and successful, whereas Roderigo is rich but not smart. The same with the fact that Roderigo is unable to win Desdemona's heart, but Othello does. That flip side. And also this idea that both of them fall for Iago's tricks, right? So in that way they're similar, they're parallel. And Iago does not kill Othello, but certainly we could say Iago stabs Othello in the back, metaphorically, right? And that this is also a similarity, that Othello is used as a plot device, like Iago uses Roderigo to get what he wants out of other people. It's also this idea that whereas Iago to the Venetians seems like a harmful person to marry, Roderigo is presented as seemingly harmless, but it's actually the opposite, right? Othello is, at least at the beginning, the good husband, and Roderigo is the useless, actually kind of dangerous one, who is very quick to describe the woman he loves in explicitly offensive and graphic terms. And they're both willing to do that so immediately. And the same with these offensively racist terms. So the purveyor of these terms, the user of these terms versus the object of these terms, Othello. And interestingly, he views that Othello has taken what he feels he's owed and deserves, whereas Othello seems to think he doesn't deserve Desdemona. But also, they both view this. They both view Desdemona's body as transactional, as something to own, as something to enjoy, as something to consume, right? That language of consumption that we talked about in a previous lesson really does speak to this idea of transactionality for them both. And then in what ways is he humorous? Just because he's kind of useless, right? In the midst of all this tragedy, it's Roderigo who's the one who sort of stands out as we're not necessarily sorry for him, right? He's a nuisance. He is a fool. here. He can't see what's in front of him. He's lovesick. He seems desperate. Would the Jacobean audience also think that these are funny? Yes. So in that way, he's also potentially humorous. And this is what he's like. This is in Act 1. Roderigo speaking to Brabantio and to Iago in these. As he says, "Hi Adamola, thank you for joining. Any questions, any comments, put them in the chat." Roderigo says, "Your fair daughter at this odd, even and dull watch of the night, transported with no worse nor better guard than with a knave of common hire, a gondolier, to the gross clasps of a lascivious Moor. If this be known to you and your allowance, then we have done you bold and saucy wrongs. But if you know not this, my manners tell me we have your wrong rebuke. Your daughter, if you have not given her leave, I say again, hath made a gross revolt, tying her beauty, wit, and fortunes in an extravagant and wheeling stranger of here and everywhere. Straight satisfy yourself. If she be in her chamber or your house, let loose on me the justice of the state for deluding you." So what stands out here? First of all, the juxtaposition between how he presents Desdemona, your fair daughter, and duty, beauty, wit, and fortunes, to the presentation of Othello as a knave of common hire, or a wrong'un, a villain, particularly one for hire, like a mercenary, which it could be that Othello is, but certainly he's not described that way by the other characters like the Duke. A gondolier, so again, this servant or a boater. The gross class of the lascivious Moor, so this idea of painting a picture of a daughter, the woman he supposedly loves, in the arms and sort of sexual activity with the lascivious Moor, the lustful, greedy, grasping Moor he's describing. Adamola, if you're in Year 8, this is a Key Stage 5 lesson. Go back to your links. You should be able to access this through Ocean and Teach Floor. Your Year 8 lesson. Okay. Now, he's very political in his language here, that while stirring it up, he's saying, my manners tell me we have the wrong ruby. So, if you knew, you must know everything about your daughter because you're a good man, you're in control of her. So we must be saying the wrong thing. You must know that she's done this in the middle of the night. And then he says, your daughter, if you've not given her leave. But if you haven't for some reason, and she's acted for some reason out of bounds, stirring him up again, then she has done something terrible, a gross revolt here, right? So now tying this gross and gross together. So tying all of her good things to this extravagant, this exorbitant stranger and cunning stranger of everywhere, not of Venice. And if I am wrong, or if I'm telling a lie, then feel free to take me to court for tricking you and giving her slander. So then as well, thinking about the publicity that this is going to bring, he's saying, go to the court and tell me. But also, I know what this looks like. And surely attacking the masculinity here under this guise of, I'm trying to help you out and trying to get on your good side because when you split up this marriage, I want Desdemona. Right? So that's interesting there. And him tying himself to the outside. My manners tell me, knowing about the state, etc. Aligning himself as an insider here. Roderigo as well, so deeply racist with this. By heaven, I'd rather be his hangman. This is when Iago says, I'm his ensign. He said, I'd rather be his hangman. I'd rather be his executioner than to follow him. So that idea of him refusing to obey, refusing to admit that Othello is of high class in the great chain of being here, and saying I'd rather kill him than then associate with him. Interesting as well, because this is so much foreshadowing here, right? That he's going to help to destroy Othello. And Roderigo, here in this last part here, what a full fortune does the thick lips owe if he can carry it thus. So what a fortune Othello has if he can get away with it. What fortune is he talking about? Desdemona. So not only is he, excuse me, using racialized epithets to describe and dehumanize Othello, he's also describing Desdemona as a full fortune that Othello can steal away. So thinking then about her as something transactional, something of value, an object for someone to take away or get back, right? And as Jameson says, Roderigo doesn't feel any loyalty towards Othello, who believes he has stolen his love for him. So this idea that Roderigo thinks he's owed Desdemona, clearly thinks he's owed Desdemona here. And in trying to help so-called Roderigo, trying to help Brabantio, he is actually just trying to get what he wants, which is Desdemona. And he thinks that he has the right to do this because he thinks Othello has no right to Desdemona here. And here as well, Roderigo says to Brabantio when calling up at the window, "Most reverend Signor, do you know my voice?" "Not I. What are you?" "My name is Roderigo." "The worse a welcome. I have charged thee not to haunt about my doors. In honest plainness thou hast heard me say my daughter is not for thee. And now in madness, being full of supper and distempering draughts, upon malicious knavery, dost thou come to start my quiet. So here Roderigo is saying, "Do you know who I am?" calling up to Brabantio. And he says, "Oh God, Roderigo, I have told you not to hang around my house. I have told you she's not for you. You can't have her. And now you've got ate and drank too much. And now upon malicious knavery, so harmful villainy, you are coming to disturb my peace." Yes, he is, but in more ways than Brabantio knows, right? This interruption of peace here is actually the catalyst of the play in many ways. Notice as well the language. Most reverend Signor, this kind of attempting to ingratiate himself with Brabantio, versus this thee and thou here, speaking down to Roderigo, both literally from the balcony, but also metaphorically in talking about the power dynamic between them, him saying like, "Get away from me, you malicious knave." That kind of language was enough to start a fight by attacking someone's reputation that way. And for Brabantio to do it really does show how much he is not giving credence to Roderigo at all. Iago also says, "If this poor trash of Venice," my goodness me, talking about Roderigo here, "whom I trace for his quick hunting, stand the putting on, I'll have our Michael Cassio on the hip." So this is what Iago actually wants. He's describing his supposed friend, who he says in other scenes, "I love thee," to Roderigo. He's calling him poor trash of Venice to us here. So again, we have to discredit everything Iago says. "Whom I trace for his quick hunting." So I'm following so I can hunt him. So this predator-prey dynamic between Iago and Roderigo. And then if he stands the putting on, if he can survive what I'm going to use him for, I'll get Cassio. So in other words, if Cassio doesn't kill him because I've asked him to stir up Cassio, then I'll really get Cassio. So this idea of him as a pawn is so clear here. Roderigo says, "I take it much unkindly that thou, Iago, who hast my purse, as if the strings were thine, should know of this." So Roderigo's saying, it doesn't look good to me that you have my purse and that you haven't told me that she got married, right? So this idea of Iago being the one who has control here, the strings were thine. Thinking later of Othello's language when he calls the strings attaching himself to Desdemona as a leash or a strings, even heartstrings, this idea of string and attachment between characters, connecting them, but Iago being the master manipulator, the kind of puppet master here between these. And then Roderigo do, what should I do? I confess it is my shame to be so fond, but it is not in my virtue to amend it. So this powerlessness of Roderigo here. He says, I am ashamed to be so in love with Desdemona, but I can't do anything about it. I'm powerless against it. And this is what is used by Iago to control Roderigo, is this idea of Desdemona. We don't even really see Desdemona and Roderigo in the same place. So it seems to be this idealized view of Desdemona. As Honigman says, this overmastering self-destructive desire for Desdemona mirrors Othello. So here they are foils again. Jameson said, he's easily led by the evil Iago. And Lumba says his wealth cannot secure Desdemona's affection. He's reduced to a powerless accomplice here as well. So we're thinking this argument is taking shape now. And then finally with Roderigo, he says, I will incontinently drown myself. And I'll explain the joke there in a moment. If thou dost, I shall never love thee after. Why, thou silly gentleman? Roderigo, it is silliness to live when to live is torment. And then we have we a prescription to die when death is our physician. So you're saying, I will drown myself with tears. Incontinence, however, is also being unable to control your bowels. So this idea of he'll drown himself by wetting himself, for example, is useless sort of babyishness and clownery here. Because what is he talking about? Both I will drown myself in my own tears sounds silly, but then I will drown myself in my own puddles is also even more so this kind of clownish figure. Iago calls him, you silly gentleman, I won't love you if you do something so stupid, in other words. And Roderigo says it's silliness to live when live is torment. So it's silliness to carry on living if it's so much torment to live. Then we have a prescription to die when death is our physician. So death is the person, death is our doctor. And so that's the only way we can heal, is by dying. We do see that Roderigo obviously comes to his end in this play as well. As Ridley says, it's his little comic relief, as there seems to be in the play. That's his purpose here, his function. And we can describe this as bathos. So any time there's comedy within a tragedy, we can describe that as bathos. It's a convention of tragedy in which there is anticlimax. So the purpose of tragedy and the structure of tragedy isn't to go just from good to bad straight down, but rather to have these hills and valleys within tragedy that actually make your emotions go on a similar roller coaster, right? If it's just getting worse, it becomes boring, right? Same way it becomes better, it just becomes boring. We need these emotional roller coasters in order to be on tenterhooks and to be worried about the characters and in a way to care about them. So bathos is the anticlimax, that kind of break in the tension, created as a result of a shift in subject matter or tone from serious or tragic to trivial or vulgar content, to create humour, absurdity, and thus catharsis. So though we were arguing in a previous lesson whether catharsis exists in terms of the ending of the play, we can say that there are kind of mini catharsis moments in Roderigo's speech, because he brings us down for a moment and back up again then when we suddenly see another vicious, violent, terrible scene. But we suddenly have this silliness of, you're going to drown yourself, that breaks the tension here and thus makes it rebuilt going forwards. So if we think about lines of argument for Roderigo then. In one way, and this is thinking about our first pieces of evidence, he again captures the racism of the upper class. He also captures the violence and dehumanization of the patriarchy. And we can link this to the Madonna-whore dichotomy, which we'll review when we take a look at Cassio, but basically divides women into a dichotomy of two, of either the Madonna figure or the whore figure, where women are either idealized. So this idea of him saying she's too much of the blessed condition, or dehumanized, objectified, whichever you prefer. Both, however, transactional. So this is linking to him describing her as a full fortune, right? So this idea that he doesn't actually think of Desdemona as a person, and even that idealized language, that religious imagery he describes to her, thinks of her as not a human, right? Argument 2, we can also think that he is used as a pawn of Iago's, or that in a way he is a foil to Othello. And could you pair these two arguments and think about him as a pawn of Iago in a way mirroring Othello? Could you split these up? Both, yes, depending on how you want to structure your argument, how you feel confident doing so. And then finally, we can think about this as this clown-like figure whose function is to provide bathos for the audience. It is potentially interesting to consider his ending, the fact that he's hurt and then killed by Iago, but that really also does fit into this idea of this pawn of Iago's, because like Othello and like Emilia and like Desdemona, he is discarded when no longer useful to Iago. So then you can think about this idea of that crossing that whole trajectory of being used as a pawn in the one paragraph. And then finally, Cassio. So I'm going to read and then we will talk about it a little bit. So Michael Cassio is the loyal but inexperienced soldier whose promotion to lieutenant initiates the plot. He is the embodiment of ideal masculinity, handsome, charismatic, gentlemanly, rational, abstemious, and loyal. He is widely regarded as such and needs to be. Otherwise, Iago's insinuations that he and Desdemona are having an affair would be disregarded. It is Cassio's perfect social reputation that make him such a perfect focus for Othello's insecurities. In Venetian society, he is everything that Othello is not. In contrast to this initial and dominant presentation, Cassio's characterization is complicated by his relationship with Bianca, a woman who has followed him from Venice and is implied to be a sex worker. Unlike his polite and courteous treatment of Desdemona and Emilia, his treatment of Bianca is belittling and mocking. He continuously rejects her publicly and makes her a laughingstock amongst the other soldiers. This reveals that even the most esteemed in society can be both hypocritical and cruel. As a powerful man, Cassio's reputation is everything. When he is manipulated by Iago in Act 2, Scene 3, he loses his most valuable possession and regrets this loss deeply. Iago knows this and uses it to drive forward his revenge. Again, it would not work if Cassio's reputation, like any man of the time, was not so crucial to his personhood. So firstly, what is Cassio like? What is Cassio like? He's loyal but inexperienced soldier, first of all. He's also the embodiment of ideal masculinity. All of these things here. He's widely regarded as such. That's important if we think about the role of society in this play. He has a perfect social reputation. Right? But also, he is these things, right? He's belittling and mocking. He's the lover of Bianca. He's maybe a little bit cruel. And he's definitely a complex character once you start digging under this reputation. Perhaps part of Shakespeare's goal, looking at this reputation. In what ways is Cassio hypocritical? Well, despite being so honourable, he's associated with a sex worker. And clearly, if that's the case, being adulterous, having sex outside of marriage, he does not treat her well, despite treating Desdemona and Emilia very politely. He rejects her, makes her a laughingstock. He's hypocritical and cruel, even though he says he's not, and acts like he's not. And what's important to him? His reputation. Most importantly. Reputation is everything. His most valuable possession. As a matter of fact, he says, I'm going to start over. I'm going to have a different career, and I'm going to have to leave Venice forever. This is going to destroy me. And Bradshaw says Shakespeare makes other important changes to his source material. He changes Cassio, just a nameless officer in the Italian story, into Othello's closest, most loved friend and confidant, as well as the man he chooses to promote as his new lieutenant. The play thus revives one of Shakespeare's most recurrent and even obsessive nightmares, this nightmare of double betrayal, in which a character thinks, rightly or wrongly, but usually wrongly, that the man he loves has stolen the woman he loves most. Double betrayal here. It's an interesting thing to think of, right? That not only is it the person you love, it's the other person you love who's involved, and they've both betrayed you here. Now, what's Cassio described like by Iago at the beginning? Iago, one Michael Cassio, a Florentine, a fellow almost damned in a fair wife, that never set a squadron in the field, nor the division of a battle knows more than a spinster, unless the bookish theoric, wherein the togaed consuls can propose as masterly as he. Mere prattle without practice is all his soldiership. But he, sir, had the election, and I, of whom his eyes had seen the proof at Rhodes, at Cyprus, and on other grounds, Christian and heathen, must be belied and calmed by debitor and creditor. This countercaster, he, in good time, must his lieutenant be. So, what does this tell us here? Firstly, one of the only characters who has two names. So clearly important. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. A Florentine as well. So not a Venetian, so also an outsider. Maybe this is why he and Othello are so linked, right? Only time we ever hear about this, almost damned in a fair wife. So almost going to hell in how lovely and fair and beautiful his wife is. Do we see his wife? No. Do we hear about her again? No. Lots of study guides will say that he doesn't have a wife, he's a bachelor. This is then interpreted slightly differently in that he thinks he is the perfect person, the ideal for a wife. But also that he doesn't have experience. He's never set a squadron in the field. He does not know battle more than a spinster. So again here the misogynistic language returns, because he's saying he's like a spinster trying to talk about sex. And thus sex and war are linked here in this idea of conquest and power and violence, right? And domination. But also linking Cassio with sex, which perhaps speaks to Othello and Iago's own insecurities, right? So like the bookish theoric. So he's talking about Cassio being the expert bookwise, right? He knows the togaed consuls, talking about the kind of philosophers wearing togas here who can talk a lot of talk, but it's mere prattle to him. So mere yap. to him without practice. But he had the election. And Iago, in contrast, had proof of his soldiership at Rhodes, at Cyprus, lots of other places. Can't be it. He is the lieutenant despite this, right? So all these positive things about him: damned and a fair wife, fellow, experienced but not violent, clearly. He's knowledgeable, he's intelligent. So he's this idea of civility and virtue that's directly opposite to the brutality of Othello's emotional turmoil. This is F.R. Leavis saying this. And interesting because in some ways he is this paragon of civility and virtue. And in some ways he is a foil to Othello, right? Because he is loyal to Othello, whereas Othello immediately is able to believe that Cassio could cheat with Desdemona. And also he's this kind of constant throughout the play who is loyal and unquestioning, not necessarily the smartest character. He doesn't really say anything clever as such, the way that Othello and Iago do. But he is this positive good in the play. We'll see, to a certain extent. And then here is another interesting part. Act 2, Scene 3 is crucial to understanding Cassio's character and also Iago's character, because this is the drunken scene. This is the fly in a trap scene. That Cassio is, when I said abstemious, he doesn't indulge a huge amount. He can't handle his liquor, and so he doesn't drink, really. Iago convinces him to drink. He gets drunk, and this is how he manages to wound Montano and start this fight in this court, in this play and this setting, in which Cyprus is under martial law. So there's a curfew, and so for a soldier to be breaking curfew is really, really bad. Cassio says, "Welcome, Iago, we must to the watch." Iago, "Not this hour, lieutenant. 'Tis not yet 10 on the clock. Our general cast us thus early for the love of his Desdemona, who let us not therefore blame. He hath not yet made wanton the night with her, and she is sport for Jove. She is a most exquisite lady, and I'll warrant her full of game. Indeed, she's a most fresh and delicate creature." So notice immediately there's different language between Iago and Cassio. "What an eye she has! Methinks it sounds a parley to provocation. An inviting eye, and yet methinks right modest. Yet what she speaks, is it not an alarum to love?" Or a herald, like a trumpet sound, calling you to love. "She's indeed perfection. Well, happiness to their sheets. Come, lieutenant, I have a stoup of wine, and here without are a brace of Cyprus gallants who would fain have a measure to the health of black Othello. Not tonight, good Iago. I have a very poor and unhappy brains for drinking. I could well wish courtesy would invent some other custom of entertainment." So, firstly, key information here. Iago, look how he just talks to Cassio. Lieutenant, and he talks about Iago as our general and black Othello. Interesting, right? That he's sort of digging in on this, firstly. Secondly, the way that Cassio and Iago both talk about Desdemona. Iago's trying to stir him up to get him to say things about Desdemona, try and picture her in that light, but he is saying things like, Othello put us on this job early, on our watch early, so that he can go off and have sex with Desdemona because he hasn't yet. And she's sport for Jove. She is someone who Zeus himself would want. And full of game, so full of tricks and deception and passion, etc. And an inviting eye, so this idea of a tempting, seductive eye, and her voice as well. And then happiness to their sheets, so picturing them in this marital bed and saying, hopefully they're enjoying it right now. Whereas Cassio says she's most exquisite, she's fresh and delicate creature, so interesting creature, separation there of her from humanity a little bit. Inviting but modest, perfection compared to Iago's. Such a contrast, these juxtaposition of these two characters and their presentations of love here. And also their willingness to engage with this kind of language. And he's very courteous. Ridley says he is key to the plot, and that is here, right? This idea that we know that Cassio is these things is courteous of Desdemona. We know that he seems to trust Iago. He calls him honest Iago and good Iago. And we know that he can't drink. He can't handle it. And this is really what hinges on it. It's when he's able to first get these prongs into Cassio that he's able to be manipulated here. So as Ridley said, he's a pivotal figure, right? With great importance to the movement of the plot. And this is one of the places where that's most clear. Here, as he drives the interruption of Othello and Desdemona's consummation, and the wounding of Montano, the falling of Cassio's reputation, and thus, if he was such a good lieutenant but is stripped of his duty for this terrible doing, then he's able to be questioned more so. And Mason says this gradations of status embedded through the text are represented in military terms. Iago is this rough-speaking officer, resentful of Cassio's rank and courtly manners. So it seems like Cassio here is seeming as higher status because he's not engaging in this kind of rough talk. And then the same, Iago's destruction of Cassio is like the final dress rehearsal before he goes on to work on Othello in Act 3, Scene 3, the play's central theme. So this is like, again, a mini version of look how much Iago can manipulate people to get his way. But then to think about him in this different way, this is Cassio and the Madonna whore dichotomy. So speaking about Bianca, and then about Desdemona in these two different columns. The first column is Bianca. She haunts me in every place. I was the other day talking on the sea bank with certain Venetians, and thither comes the bauble, and by this hand she falls thus about my neck. So hangs and lolls and weeps upon me, so shakes and pulls me. Ha ha ha. I notice, interestingly, immediately, dehumanizing her, talking about her bauble, a decoration, hanging on his neck, begging it, haunting him, following him around, and with certain Venetians, so being like, ugh, she came up to me when I was talking to important people and made me look bad, and laughing about them. 'Tis such another fish another sex worker. Marry a perfumed one. What do you mean by this haunting of me? This is him yelling out to Bianca. She comes before me. Look where she comes. Let the devil and his dam haunt you. What did you mean by that same handkerchief you gave me even now? I was a fine fool to take it. I must take out the work, a likely piece of work, that you should find it in your chamber and not know who left it there. It's some minx's token. And I must take out the work? Therefore give it to your hobby horse. Wheresoever you had it, I'll take out no work on it. So here is the handkerchief. And Cassio gives it to Bianca to copy the pattern because he likes it, before giving it back, or if someone takes it back. And she gets jealous and thinks that this is someone else he is sleeping with, she's left in his chamber, so she throws it back to him. So again, this pivotal part of the plot, because it's this exchange and this viewing of Cassio having this handkerchief. Remember, Othello is watching this scene, seeing Bianca produce the handkerchief and saying, here, this is yours, to Cassio. What do you mean having it in your room? This hobby horse, this other sex worker that you were using, taking advantage of, spending time with. I'm not doing your work for you. I'm not copying someone else's handkerchief. Get her to do it then. Cassio also talking about marrying her. I marry her. What? A customer? Prithee, bear some charity to my wit. So give me some credit. Be nice to me. Don't think it's so unwholesome. And then the ha 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 again. The laughing at her in public here is really quite an ungenerous and nasty side of Cassio here. Compared especially with Cassio talking about Desdemona. Oh, behold, you men of Cyprus, let her have your knees. Hail to thee, lady, and the grace of heaven, before, behind thee, and on every hand, enwheel thee around. So literally saying, everyone, while she's arriving to the dock, get on your knees and pay homage to this lady, this Madonna figure, almost like the Virgin Mary visiting, right? He also describes the divine Desdemona, she that I spake of, our great captain's captain. Great Jove, Othello guard, and swell his sail with thine own powerful breath, that he may bless this bay with his tall ship, make love's quick pants in Desdemona's arms, and give renewed fire to our extincted spirits, and bring all Cyprus comfort. So here again, thinking of her as this powerful, supernatural figure, but also saying, please let Othello get here, give him good winds, etc., so that he can embrace Desdemona when he gets here. But it's sexualized as well, right? It's this love quick pants in Desdemona's arms. It sounds sexualized here as well. Either he's paying homage to her or he is imagining her in this way as well. Kermode says this religious love for Desdemona's purity, which juxtaposes so strongly with his physical love, supposedly of Desdemona here. And then the Walker saying, though for the most part a gentleman, Cassio displays a lack of true respect and commitment to women as a whole. Yes, here and here, right? In his treatment of Bianca, and also in somewhat his idealization of Desdemona as well. The Madonna-whore dichotomy definition is there. If you didn't know it, we've reviewed it a couple of times. This division into two embodiments, Madonna and the whore. And then as well, this reputation here. Iago saying, what are you hurt, Lieutenant? This is after the fight. Cassio says, I passed all surgery, so ideal, fatally. Marry, heaven forgive. Reputation, reputation, reputation. Oh, I've lost my reputation. I've lost the immortal part of myself. And what remains is bestial. My reputation, Iago, my reputation. So look how many times he says reputation here. Clearly important to us, that emphasis. Notice the prose as well here. It's no longer iambic pentameter. He's lost the structured language he had. He's become prosaic. He's fallen in society. And that makes sense because he says he's lost the immortal part, his soul, really, of himself. What he remains is bestial, is animalistic, is less than human. Cassio also says at the end of the play, when Othello finally reveals all of this and it all comes out, dear General, I never gave you cause. So notice he's not blaming Othello for doubting him. And when Othello kills himself, Cassio says, this I did fear, but thought he had no weapon, for he was great at heart. So this idea of, I was worried he was going to commit suicide, but thought he didn't have a weapon, but he was, in a way he's saying, brave enough to do this, or, impassioned enough to commit suicide rather than wait for the punishment. And Ludovico says, your power and your command is taken off, and Cassio rules in Cyprus. To you, Lord Governor, is now who Cassio is, remains the censure of this hellish villain, the time, the place, the torture. Oh, enforce it. So Cassio's role at the end, he becomes Lord Governor of Cyprus and has to punish Iago. Walker says, an exceptional character who they, the audience, can identify with, admire for his loyalty and steadfastness. A foil to Othello, who doubts so quickly and so immediately. Cassio's rupture with Othello provides a number of disquieting foreshadows of Othello's future. So this bestial, losing control, becoming prosaic, etc., that is very much mirroring Othello's own destruction, self-destruction. And Lever says Cassio represents, and this is the same idea, this idea of civility and virtue. So he does not lose faith the same way as Othello does, and thus is shown to be good at the end and risen up in the end. Interestingly as well that he's a Florentine, so he's an outsider, as I said. He says that this is the reason for the way he greets people, so he kisses Emilia in front of Iago. Let it not gall your patience, good Iago, that I extend my manners. 'Tis my breeding that gives me this bold show of courtesy. So he's saying, don't blame me for kissing your wife. This is how we do things where I'm from, and this is polite where I'm from. Not a good thing to do in front of Iago in Iago's current state with what we know about him, especially how good-looking and flirtatious Cassio is. But as a result, Iago knows that this is just his habit and is able to manipulate what other people would see as forward in Othello's mind. So even though it's just custom for Cassio and he's not trying to seduce Emilia or Desdemona that we know of, Iago knows how it looks and knows that it's different than the other Venetians, and knows thus that he can put that seed into Othello's mind. Same with Iago saying, with as little a web as this, talking about these polite manners and flirtations, etc., kissing Desdemona's hand, kissing Emilia, playing with her, Desdemona's hand, as he speaks to her. With this little a web I will ensnare as great a fly as Cassio. I smile upon her, do, while I will gyve thee in thine own courtship. So I'll basically get you and sink you in your own courtship, or trick you in your own courtship. So here we have Iago's motif of entrapment here, as well as thinking about the idea of, I know what you're doing and I'm going to use what you do to trip you. And with this as well, thinking of him as the master manipulator here, and these asides as being crucial. Iago also says has a beauty in his daily life that makes me ugly. So this idea of juxtaposition between the two that really does come out in the play, right? They are absolutely foils here. And again, Lewis's quotation here, this ideal, I think as well we could argue he is this ideal that opposes Iago as well as this master manipulator, if Cassio is this. Lines of argument about Cassio. Firstly, we can think of him as this epitome of masculinity, which is why he becomes an object of jealousy for Roderigo, for Iago, and for Othello, obviously. We could say this. We could also say that Cassio here is a foil to Othello. Loyal, trusting, widely beloved, etc. We can think about him again as a pawn of Iago's, and it's actually his goodness that destroys him. We can think of him as a foil to Iago as well. Or Roderigo, but that gives us slightly less scope because they don't really interact so much. We can think of him as well this idea of hypocritical in his treatment of women. And this could be broken up into two different paragraphs. His idealization of Desdemona versus his humiliation of Emilia and dehumanization of her as well. And then finally with this, thinking about Iago and Roderigo's language versus Cassio's language. Here, there is a lot more prosaic language, which means it's more prose and less iambic pentameter, whereas Cassio's is for the most part iambic pentameter. So extremely controlled, very much like Othello's at the beginning. Whereas Iago and Roderigo, especially when they're scheming, or when they're being horrible in their language, so in their kind of graphic language, becomes prosaic. It's also their vulgar, sexual and racist language and descriptions and imagery. Whereas Cassio is courteous, idealized language, right? Except when talking about Bianca, where he does fall into those same pitfalls, which then perhaps shows this kind of ubiquitousness of violence against women. We also, with that sexist and racist language, we do also have Cassio as never racist. He's loyal to Othello and loves Othello. Whereas here it's obvious they don't. They hate Othello. Whoops. As evidenced in their language. Indeed, it's only when that Cassio's language loses control is when in the reputation scene, Act 2, Scene 3, when he loses control and then loses his reputation as a result. So really here it's highlighted so clearly how different they are as characters. These are morally wrong characters, and this is a morally right character, which is perhaps why we see such a disparity in their treatment at the end. Cassio is rewarded. He becomes Lord General and is chosen to dispense Iago's punishment, whereas Iago survives but his reputation is destroyed. He's taken away in chains, and Roderigo is dead. So this idea of them and their manipulative, obfuscatory language. So this idea of this unclear language versus this kind of clear, honest, if slightly exuberant language. Here. That brings us to the end of our lesson. Apologies, we did run over a little bit, but hopefully you found this useful. Really appreciate everyone who joined, and I look forward to seeing you for our next lesson, which will be on one of our first themes, which will be jealousy in the play. Look forward to seeing you then. Have a great rest of your night, and if you're watching this back, I hope this was helpful for you as well. Take care now. Bye.